So, okay, so first of all, could you tell me about how your story began?
What bit do you really want to know?
Well, I read that you were a cowboy. So I don't know if that was the start of it or if there was something before that kind of led.
Uh, yeah, I wouldn't say I was a cowboy as any sort of enduring aspect of my life. When I was, so I grew up in Windsor, which is sort of, a fairly middle class town in England. Obviously, it's got a big castle in it. I didn't grow up in the castle,
Mhm.
sadly,
Nice.
but that's home for me. And my mum always used to take us out walking in the Great Park and areas like that. I basically grew up in social housing, uh, but it was in Windsor, so we had good access to the outdoors and so on, which was great.
Mhm.
But I wasn't really much of an outdoorsman in any particularly strong way. But what
Yeah.
I did do is just enjoyed being outside. Um, when I was going through sixth form, one of the things I did was I started to work up at one of the stables in the Great Park in exchange for learning how to ride horses. So I learned how to ride horses in return for mucking out where the horses live.
Nice.
And that was a enjoyable experience. And I thought when I eventually went to university, there were only three things I really wanted to do. One was to spend more time riding horses, and I thought the best way to do that is be a cowboy. One is to play more rugby in New Zealand, because New Zealand's quite good at rugby. And the other one was to become a ski instructor in France, because the French are quite good at skiing. None of which I'd really done much of before the age of 17. And I tried skiing for the first time at uni. And so, yeah, after uni finished, I went off to go and do those three things. I did a ski season in France.
Mhm.
I did worked a bit as a cowboy in Australia, a jackaroo as they call them down there. And then I went off to New Zealand to play rugby, and that's actually where I trained as a ski instructor. And I came back to Europe to do that. So that the cowboying was merely a way to go and ride horses and also get a bit of an insight into sort of outback Australian culture. I think it's very easy to go to places, particularly Australia and New Zealand, and just see them as places for just fun or, getting drunk and traveling up and down the East Coast. But both of them have environments and cultures that are really interesting to spend time with. And Southern Ireland, New Zealand rugby culture is a really interesting thing to go and explore. The outdoors is very much part of life down there. A lot of the guys that played rugby in the club were sheep farmers or hunters. So it was good to get an insight into that real rural community.
Mhm. Okay. So you don't really fit the typical explorer typecast, so ex-army, white. I was wondering if your race and gender has helped you or held you back in any way?
So I am actually in the Army Reserve now.
Ah,
And one of the reasons I did that was partly because, so being a brown person growing up in a town like Windsor, I remember people saying things to me like, I don't think of you as Asian, Ash, or I don't like Asians, but you're all right, which are effectively microaggressions, because the underlying thing about that is, I don't like Asians, but because you behave like a white person, you're okay to us. That's the I guess that's the deeper meaning inherent in that statement. So I'd always had mixed or conflicting feelings about what it meant to be British, because even in the 90s, the BNP had a few council seats. Nick Griffin was doing quite well on TV. Of course, a lot of that sort of stuff has now just been legitimised and subsumed within some of the parties and ideas that ended up leading towards Brexit. And I think that sort of dangerous English nationalism, when I say English as against British nationalism, because I think it's different to Welsh and Scottish nationalism,
yeah.
it is still very much there as an undercurrent. How did that fit into my race, my travel, and then what I did with regards to choosing to join the army? Well, I thought the army was always going to be a really good place to develop skills. My ethnicity was never any barrier to me joining the army. In the end, I chose to not join the regular army in 2003 because of the war in Iraq, which I'd done philosophy as a degree, and I felt that was an unjustified war. I joined the Army Reserve because I felt I had skills to offer in regards to media, which I was doing as my job largely by then, video production in particular, but also because it's a really good place to develop and learn things. Like, you learn a lot of practical and outdoors skills, which are very useful. But, you know, I'm certainly not of that British colonial explorer mindset. I'm half Indian, and I've seen, you know, from a young age, I knew the alternative stories of British colonisation. And until fairly recently, I would say it was widely accepted that the British Empire was a benign empire. When you go to India, and it's a very different story there. They will tell you the stories of what was effectively a military occupation, conquest, full of war crimes, looting and dispossession of land, various other really unpleasant things. So I was always aware of that. So travel to me was not about going to places for physical ardor and proving how tough I was and looking at those pickaninnies with watermelon smiles, as our Prime Minister calls them. To me, it was a way of engaging and understanding with a local culture with empathy. You know, going to Australia and New Zealand, Australia to work as a jackaroo, even though I wasn't with the Aboriginal culture, of course, and going to New Zealand to play rugby in the South Island, again, not with the Indigenous Maori culture, but it gave me an insight into the culture of those two places. Maybe not the perfect examples, but by that I mean I think travel and exploration is all about cultural exploration. But I don't like the term explorer. I don't think it makes any sense. I think what explorer means is precursor to colonization, conquest, occupation, dispossession, and imperialism. That's what an explorer is. You know, if you look at the great people who are venerated as explorers in British history, Burton and Speke, what did they lead on to? They led on to the exploitation and dispossession of those lands around Central Eastern Africa. That's what most explorers lead to. They're merely the reconnaissance party of imperialism.
Yeah. See, I went to Canada last year, and I learned about the Indigenous people, like, for pretty much the first time, because in the UK on the curriculum we just never learn about it. And ever since then, my personal view of the term explorer has been completely thrown out the window.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good example. I think it's also important, you know, if someone has had a view on something and then information and education changes their way or opinion on it, you shouldn't hold them to account for their old views if they can demonstrate that they've improved them. I think one of the great problems we have with things like Twitter is you can express a view 3-4 years ago, have become educated on a matter, and still be held to account for something you said 3-4 years ago, even if you've generally altered that. So yeah, and I think one of the intriguing challenges that face us within Britain right now, see all the movement that happened in April around BLM and so on. You know, the challenges we face in Britain in relation to race are quite different to those that are faced in the United States. We don't have militarised and poorly trained and poorly equipped police service. I'd say the British police service is pretty excellent, and most of those that I know that work within the police are really, well, all those that I know that work within the police are really good people that do a lot of really good community policing. We don't have the same problems that the United States has with effectively a paramilitary force on the streets to enforce a very different penal system. Britain's challenges around race revolve around narrative, largely with respect to our colonial past, our lack of acknowledgement of it. We didn't have slavery within the UK to the same extent, but we certainly benefited from it as a nation, or Britain as a nation became wealthy from it. So I think having those insights and that willingness to change it is partly driven by going to other places. You went to Canada to learn that. I'm half Indian, that's where I learned it from. I recently was in the North Island of New Zealand, which gave me a much stronger insight into the legacy of I'm wearing an All Blacks t-shirt. The legacy of the colonisation of New Zealand by Pakeha, as they're known in New Zealand, white people. So yeah, you know, I would say that is probably where interesting travel sits these days. It's about revealing insights to yourself that you can then take home and share with other people.
Yeah, I agree. You mentioned that you studied philosophy.
Yeah.
I was wondering, because I read that you met the Dalai Lama. So would you say that has helped you in situations like meeting the Dalai Lama? And also, how was the Dalai Lama?
So philosophy as a degree So this, the subject matter of philosophy is one thing. I'd say where philosophy is more useful is it teaches you a skill, which is critical thinking. Critical thinking is, here's a body of work, here's some text, let me read it and see what I think about it. Let me see if I can extract the key points out of it, summarize the key arguments, and then critique and assess that. That's what philosophy does as a subject. You learn how to do that in 1,500 words. So for what I do now as a job, which is write travel articles and columns, usually framed around a particular theme or idea, that's vital, and that's really important. The subject matter was useful in some areas and less useful in others. I did the philosophy of religion, which was great, philosophy of science, which is really good. I don't think I really found the philosophy of time particularly useful, but obligation, dissent and war, justice, all those other things are really intriguing and important subjects, because they're things that the way different nations approach those ideas, or different groups approach those ideas, that tends to be what distinguishes one nation from another. You know, do we believe in a certain value system or another? Do we believe in this approach? Do we believe in a vengeance and deterrent approach to justice, or do we believe in a rehabilitative approach? So if you have that background framework, then you can bring that to your travel in a more critical thinking way. Also very good for detecting fake news and political influence. But when it came to meeting the Dalai Lama, I mean, you don't really ask the Dalai Lama a question. The Dalai Lama speaks at you and tells you what you need to know. So that, I found that great. You know, we walked in and spoke to the Dalai Lama, and he just told us stuff. You know, you don't really ask the Dalai Lama a question. Yeah, and he was great. He has a remarkable ability to make you feel important. Very charismatic person. You know, I'm sure he's probably met more people of different levels of society than anyone else on earth.
Yeah,
quite possibly. And actually had a proper conversation with them. Yeah, he was great. Yeah. I also learned compassion from him. Compassion for your enemies, because not that I have a lot of enemies, but he was talking about how to get into Tibet. That was what he was telling us, and he told us about, you know, sneaking in and or sneaking out, and he said that he'd learned that from the Chinese communists. Now, if you know anything about the history of Tibet and China, you'll know that the Chinese communists have basically ethnically cleansed Tibet, or done their best to, or at least culturally cleansed Tibet, down to, you know, murdering tens of thousands of his people or more, and then basically displacing them with Han Chinese. So for someone to be able to know that a nation and a group have done that to his people, and yet still have the wisdom and compassion to go, yeah, they've done all these really terrible things, but I learned this from them. I thought that was a really good insight to learn from the Dalai Lama.
Yeah, definitely. Very cool. You've written for really big publications such as The Telegraph. So yeah. I was wondering how that came about and how you kind of broke into the industry.
So I think it's a very long, slow process. And you could, of course, have, you know, I think there's probably two approaches. Nepotism. You can either come from a family where your dad is the editor of The Guardian or something like that, and that helps you get your, and you live in London, and therefore you don't need to, you can stay with your family and you can do free internships and you can have all your connections given to you that way. That's one way to do it. Go to Oxbridge. Or another one that the way that I did it was I basically started writing blogs, started to write tips and things like that. So that was my way of starting out. Started my blog and then started to do free pieces for newspapers, free pieces for magazines, and then eventually started to get paid pieces for blogs and magazines. And actually the first piece I ever got in print, I was working for a PR company, and they were doing a piece about polo in the park, and City AM had written a piece and completely misspelled it and got it all wrong.
Yikes.
So they basically persuaded them to let me write the piece instead. So it was an unpaid piece for City AM, but basically that was my first byline in a paper, and then wrote a few for magazines connected to that PR company. And then for the Telegraph, who else had I written? I've probably started to go to loads of events, loads of travel events, and just watch people that I admired. And Nicholas Crane was doing a talk at the Adventure Travel Show. I went to go and watch him, and I went up after and said, "Oh, I really like your work. I think you're really, really good." And he said, "Oh, great. What do you do?" And I told him that I was trying to do more travel journalism and travel writing. He said, "What kind of stuff?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to go to take my dad's ashes to India." And he said, "Oh, I love India. It's been years since I've been there, but I did some travels there." So, look, I've got to go and grab a cup of coffee with a friend, but I think you should meet him. And he introduced me to a guy called Michael Kerr, who was the then deputy editor of the Telegraph travel section. And so, yeah, that was being in the right place and asking questions and speaking to people, but already having that body of work behind me.
That's very good, yeah. One of your biggest pieces was when you spent 6 months walking across Russia's European border. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about how that came about and what it was like.
So I didn't actually walk across it. I walked parts of it.
Okay.
But most of that journey was actually by train. It's like 8,500 kilometers. I would not walk that in 6 months.
Yeah, okay.
Probably about 18 to 24 months probably that would have taken, given some of the terrain. I'd gone to, this is where the Army Reserve helps. So as an Army Reservist, you do bits and pieces every year. You don't do full-time work for the Army. And you kind of have to maintain a level of competence that isn't at quite the same level as a regular Army unit always. But you kind of, you have to keep your skills in. And if you're going to go and get deployed somewhere, you do full-time training on something. That year, the 2-week training package was in Estonia, where the sister battalion of 7 Rifles, my regiment, my battalion, had just gone out there as part of this NATO deployment, because Russia had just invaded and occupied Crimea, and they had invaded eastern Ukraine to foment the civil war over there. Unmarked troops. So yeah, everyone in Europe was a bit worried about this. So the British Army were deployed for a permanent rotation in Estonia. We went out there and were one of the training troops that year. And I was just amazed by it, because I didn't know this story. I didn't know the story about the fact that 20% of Estonia is Russian, 20% of Estonia is ethnic Russian. I didn't understand what had happened there during World War II and the legacy that had on the culture. It was interesting to go to a place where the World War II narrative wasn't Britain good, Russia good, America good, Germany bad. It was a case of Soviet Union bad, Nazi Germany bad. We were stuck in the middle. That was a kind of Estonian narrative, which isn't one we really hear, because we don't ever hear about the fact that Russia aligned, or Soviet Union, was Hitler's greatest ally for 2 years and helped him, and they divided up Europe together, and they invaded Poland together. It's not a narrative that you hear about, and you don't think about what happened to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Eastern Prussia, all of these parts of Europe that are not common British holiday destinations. It just fascinated me to think, God, there's all this history that's having an impact today in our current affairs, in the fact that I'm here with an army unit because of something that happened 80 years ago. If Russia comes across the border today and does to Estonia what they've done to Ukraine, I would have to come here and fight that. Why? I want to understand it more. So I realised there were lots of these stories like what had happened in Estonia all along the Russia-European border. So I travelled it all the way overland, and it took me about 6 months to do the whole thing. Did a podcast, Edgelands, for the Telegraph, and wrote about it and made a bunch of videos for it.
Very cool.
But I think the most important thing about any trip, it's very easy to look at a trip in terms of the output you make and in terms of a career element, where actually the most important thing is always what have you learned from that about the place? What's the new insights? What new skills have you developed? And by skills, I don't mean starting a fire with 2 pieces of flint. Empathy and compassion and insight. I think those are the more useful skills. Yeah,
I agree. What would you say is one of the hardest things that you faced over all of your journeys across the world?
Everything's hard in different ways, really. I think most of the real challenges were my own putting pressure on myself to try and turn something into a TV or a book project rather than seeing it as a travel project in and of itself that's valuable regardless. I'd say that's where most of my challenges and pressures have come from. You know, get tired, you have to walk long distances, your feet hurt, you know. No one really cares about any of that stuff, and I don't think it's that interesting. One of the useful things about the army is that you definitely just get used to tolerating discomfort and realizing that nobody cares, and it's not that interesting. And you get used to carrying heavy things. But other than that, I think I probably spent a bit too much time trying to do too many different things on the new Iron Curtain project, which is the Eastern Europe one. Russia's European border one. You know, I was trying to do social media, podcasting, filming, planning, writing, all at the same time. So I think I probably just overwhelmed myself a bit with tasks to do that.
Yeah. Can I ask, with all of your filming, what you would recommend to be one of the best documentary cameras?
Depends what your objective is and what your output is. I use a Sony. Will it around? Yeah, I have. I use a little Sony Handycam. It's not flash. It's about that big. It's that one. It's a Sony. What is it? I don't even know what it's called. FDR AX53. Okay. That is the updated version of the one that we used on Walking the Nile. I think we used it on the Caucasus one with Lev, so I was working as a shooting AP on some of those. And yeah, it's good because it's robust. What you don't want is when you're dealing with all those things I just talked about, is have to think about your camera in the middle of doing something. You want your camera to just work. And that has an autofocus, has an auto exposure. You know, you're not going to get the most beautiful shots at it, and sometimes it focuses on the wrong point. But you stick a top mic on it, you can hear people, you can film stuff, and it's fairly indestructible. And it only costs about 700 quid. So yeah, that's great. But you know, if you're then going to add another camera on top, probably the Sony Alpha 7S3. Yeah, that's a beautiful camera, good for photography as well. So that's the one that you would get as a second.
Yeah, okay, it sounds good, because for the Walking Whales expedition, we have, I have it with me, it's just a normal Canon, and it's the EOS 700D, and I don't know if you've worked with it or if you would recommend it, or if we should get something else because we haven't shot anything before. So you have,
look, the things are always, the biggest thing, films have been made with a Canon 7D and a Canon 5D, which are much older than that. Your kit and equipment should not hinder you. It should allow you to do what you're trying to do. The main effort of any kit or equipment is, don't let it get in your way. Does it achieve what you want to do? The biggest problems in filmmaking are ability to use a camera, ability to plan and write a story, and audio. Those are the things that mess everyone up. So rather than spending your money on a camera, spend on a new camera. Spend your money on learning how to shoot and edit. There's a guy down in Brighton who runs something called the Explorers Film School, which is one of the first blogs I ever wrote about. He's great. You go and spend 3 days down with him. Outdoors, obviously. Talent Manager, they do some really, DV Talent, they do some really good courses in shooting and editing. And yeah, just get a decent top mic. But, that camera's great. And it does the job really well. But whether or not you have a good film won't depend on your camera.
Yeah, okay, that's good to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Who was your inspiration when you were growing up? Was there someone that you looked up to?
I was thinking about this the other day, and I've forgotten what my answer was. Yeah, probably who are the ones that I really looked up to. I've just watched the new Michael Palin documentaries, The Travels of a Lifetime, which is on BBC. Get on BBC iPlayer at the moment. It's brilliant. So Michael Palin's stuff is a really good example of travel, because it's not about how hard something is. It's not about the physical suffering, the tolerance of or the discomfort. and it was the first travel program like it. It was the first time we followed a person through his journey, and it was before we had celebrity travelogues. No one had made anything like Michael Palin when Michael Palin's documentaries were made. And he is such a pleasant person to spend time with. And the reason is he connects with everybody he meets. And he is so curious and inquisitive about them and the things that really excite, the things that make them human. I think that's what makes, Palin really different to all the others. And he has such an authentic connection. I mean, he's a very funny person naturally, but that humour comes from warmth and the ability to connect to people. So, I would say Palin inspired me. Obviously, all of the logistics and everything was planned by a production crew, fixed by the 20 people on his crew on set and back in the office. But in terms of a mindset to take, I'd say Palin's is a great one. The other stuff that really inspired me was Star Trek. I loved The Next Generation and then Deep Space Nine. And I think it was the inquisitiveness about other cultures. It was the tolerance of other cultures. And it was, again, the mindset that they took into it. It was about discovery and exploration of new worlds, new civilizations, and new cultures. But it was all built and framed in a very warm approach, again, I'd say. I think that's good.
Okay. Can I ask what your dream project would be?
The new Iron Curtain was pretty great. That was awesome. I'm currently working on a couple of ideas in India. I think I don't like the idea of a dream project per se. I think I've been lucky enough to go to all of the places I want to go to and see them all in different ways. I think I really want to do a journey in India following the path and the stories of my dad's side of the family, the Indian side of the family. There's some interesting history that intersects with British history there. So that'll be a journey across India. But I'm not like, I've walked 3,000 miles with Lev, and I've done all those sorts of things. I don't think there's many. I guess the thing about a dream project is, are you doing it for you, or are you doing it to try and turn it into something big? Lev will happily admit that Walking the Nile was partly done just because he wanted to write an interesting book and he wanted to do something that really broke through. I don't think he spent his entire life wanting to walk along the Nile for 9 months. But there's a lot more places I want to go, and there's a lot more stories that I want to tell, dozens of them. But I wouldn't say I've got like an equivalent of Walking the Nile or another New Iron Curtain that I'm like, that's the big one that I want to do.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. So I have one last question.
Yeah.
And that is, what's next?
Who knows? And with COVID at the moment, I think it makes it very difficult to plan anything, and I don't think there's anything to worry about that really. I'd like to go and do a big project in India. There's, I think India's a fascinating place because it's a nation that was founded in its modern form only 75 years ago as a country, 73 years ago, on a secular identity and an inclusive identity. And in recent years, it's been really captured by populism under Prime Minister Modi. And I think that would be an interesting place to go and see that change in an extraordinarily diverse country, because it is a continent. So you have so many subcultures, and you've got more diversity in India than you have in Europe, and yet we think of it as much more of a homogenous place. And it has been captured with the political homogeneity that we haven't seen in Europe, for example. So that would be a fascinating thing to do for all those reasons. What's motivated that? I do want to go and see quite a bit more of South America. Never been through Indonesia and Bali and that sort of region. So there's plenty of things sort of bubbling away, but I'm not too attached to any specific ideas. The most likely next one that I'd like to do is, I've wanted to do some journeys in Britain for a long time, and I think now is probably the right time to do them. A guy called Simon Parker is currently cycling from the top of Scotland down the west coast, I think probably down to John O'Groats. So I think I'll probably wait till spring And a guy called Will Hyde suggested, well, why didn't you just do it the other way? In which case I might do that and probably do it up the east side of Britain rather than through the west. So I kind of go through the Fens and up to Yorkshire rather than down through Cumbria and that sort of region.
Yeah, sounds really cool.
Thanks. How are your plans going for your Welsh walk?
So it had to be postponed because of COVID, just because we want to stay with people. So we're hoping next May we're going to be able to do it. So like right now I want to be in Canada, but because I'd be staying with vulnerable communities and like just going to places where, you know, there aren't many cases, it just wasn't a good idea. And also I couldn't enter the country. So everything is just kind of on hold, waiting to see what happens.
I think that's good. There was an Instagram influencer who travelled to Socotra right at the beginning of the pandemic and got a huge amount of very legitimate anger directed towards her for increasing the risk to a very vulnerable region. Again, she seems to possibly have expressed genuine change through that process. But I think you're right. You know, one of the whole things about travel is it tends to be very egocentric about what the traveller wants to do with things. And I think it's something I've learned recently, or only learned to express recently, is you know, travel is often framed in what you can take. What did you learn from this place? What pictures did you get? Who did you meet?
Yeah.
But I think just as important, more important than taking, is what do you receive from a place? What did they tell you? You know, what did they want you to know? Because often when you go somewhere, you want to have a certain image or story reinforced. Whereas if the people of that place may want you to learn or take something different from it. So I think being willing to receive what they are telling you is an important thing.
Yeah, that's it. And I feel like especially with the Canada documentary, like going out as a white person, staying with people that are vulnerable, bringing over, you know, another illness, like that's not a good idea at all. Like just repeating history again and again, like.
Yeah, and if you completely, yeah. And if you think about what happened in the Americas during the colonization by Europeans, it's it's a really good point.
Yeah, thanks.
Full echo. So I just realised you asked what's my next big project.
Yeah.
And I just remember what it is. I'm doing it's a podcast called The First Mile with my friend Pip. So Pip Stewart are releasing The First Mile, and what underpinned it was trying to understand. There's a sort of metaphor saying the hardest part of any journey is the first mile.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how do you get through the first mile? Now, Lev always says that the hardest part of any journey is getting to the start line. So we wanted to really dig into what was the first mile of everybody's journey. But we also realised that one of the things that's not done in podcasting, which I'd done with the Telegraph on Edgelands, is travel narrative. So it's using audio dispatches from a place and telling the story in a reasonably creative way, usually through interview and audio and sound effects, as in what you've recorded in that place. So the podcast has got dispatches from places plus these conversations with people framed around getting through the first mile of their journey. So that is released on 4th of November. And so you can just look up The First Mile on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get it. That's our big project. That's my big project.
Yeah, I saw Pip's story about it. It looks really good.
Yeah, we'll see. Let's hope it is good. Good luck. Keep me updated with what you're up to.
All right, sounds good. Stay safe.
You too. Speak to you soon. Bye.
See you soon. Bye.